Hello. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Quincus Talk webinar today. And we'd like to thank you for making the time to attend this webinar. Before we get started, we'd like to go over a few of the webinar house rules to ensure that this session will go smoothly. During this session, we would mute the attendees. However, there will be a chat room that you guys can actually type the questions that will be answered by the panelists during the Q&A sessions. And we are also recording this webinar session, and the recording will be available on our social media and will be sent to your email as well that you register with. Okay. Thank you, everyone. All right, so we're gonna start now. And I would like to introduce the two speakers for today. We have in this panelist, Jonathan. He's our CEO and co-founder of Quincus. He was featured in Forbes 30 Under 30 Asia last year. And he's been involved in developing and leading manufacturing and supply chain technologies for the last 10 years. And for the second panelist, we also have Willson. Willson is an entrepreneur with an over a decade experience as well in the manufacturing space. And currently he's the chairman of Singapore Manufacturing Consortium. And he's dedicated to bringing the industry 4.0 to Singapore and abroad. Thank you, guys. And my name is Lina. I'm the head of delivery at Quincus, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. So, all right. I guess the panelists can unmute yourself.
Thanks for having us. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, so during this webinar, we're going to look into the FMCG sector. So yeah, we're gonna start with a few questions that we have prepared. So Willson, what do you think the situation right now in the supply chain area with FMCG?
That's a very good question. It's actually a very broad question as well. So, I mean, it's quite timely of a question as well, as I'm actually standing right now at the Arcstone's digital research lab here at the ARTC. It's our command center that's located here. And one of the things that we work with a lot of FMCG customers is that it's a matter of a lack of visibility is the biggest problem and a pain point. What COVID has essentially brought up to us is that there's always this uncertainty now of will your shipments even arrive, especially at the beginning when the lockdowns were happening. You had factories that were ready to run in certain areas, but no materials to run with because ports were not open or they were not able to get materials to come in. Right. Supply chain resiliency is a critical factor. And it's not just a matter of knowing where your products are, but also at the level of knowing where your production processes of all your suppliers are as well. Because it's one thing to know that it has been put onto a ship or onto a plane as in route, but it's a whole other thing if you even know if the production has started or if it can start and if enough raw materials at your supplier side can actually perform the work. So all this is really around the lack of visibility. It's been the biggest pain point that we've been trying to solve and working around. And this is something that Arcstone has been driving very heavily as well. And together with Quincus, this is what has really been needed in the industry, which is providing this layer of transparency. And that's what will help us get to that next level as well.
Okay, yeah, no, totally agree. Thank you, Willson. So Jonathan, what do you think the supply chain and manufacturing side still needing from the technology side to solve in this area?
Right, and thank you for having us, Lina. I think I want to latch on to one keyword that Willson said, and that is very much related to visibility. I think a lot of what we do comes around to that, and this sounds really easy to do, but it's actually incredibly hard. And here's the reason why. When we implement a supply chain solution, which looks at the moving parts, so the shipments of goods, whether it's through air, ship, or rail, or car, then that's one set of solutions. But then there is also a whole other set that talks about the actual factories themselves and what happens in the warehouses, part and part also what Willson's doing. And then the problem arises of, okay, you have visibility over the two separate items, but how do you combine those, right? How do you get visibility from the moment you step outside of a factory floor, you go totally dark. And the moment you step outside of a car, you go totally dark. So how do you combine that data to have in one view to be able to then plan your supply chain process, not just from a moving shipments and moving your goods or your raw materials to the factories and between factories, but also moving it, actually knowing when to plan your manufacturing process. So really to then get to the crux of your question, I think what is really required is the integration of these kind of technologies, right? And we're not then talking just about manufacturing solutions and supply chain solutions, but we're also talking about the underlying types of technologies of IoT systems, manufacturing sensors, vehicle sensors, GPS sensors, temperature control sensors. All of these things need to feed up back into a data platform that the eventual users can then actually control, right? And be able to have visibility, but also to have that control. And that's a current issue, and we all need to work together in that, and all of us as technology companies need to work together at that, and not just work in our own isolation silo, but really work together to get those integrated.
Right.
I think, just to piggyback on that, sorry, Lina, I wanted to jump in here because there's two critical points also that Jonathan brought up that was very important. One is that trying to work in the silo right now is essentially, paddling around with just one oar, right? It doesn't work. What we see more and more of is that the proper solutions that customers need is a solution, not a provider or one provider only. It is an integrated solution that crosses between, just as we mentioned. We may be experts from Arcstone's standpoint inside of the factory floor, but outside of that, we need Quincus to come in to actually provide the lack of visibility that we don't have there, and vice versa. And integrating that portion is a critical factor. And it doesn't mean it's just going to be Arcstone and Quincus. There will be other players, the hardware providers, the other solution providers, the services. All this needs to be brought together. Now, the other aspect I do want to bring on is that there is this incongruent process of some companies being much more further ahead in their digitalization journey as compared to others. It's one thing to look at trying to do digitalization for a large multinational enterprise that has their own factories that have a grand kind of global enterprise level deployment. But then when you look into the supply chain itself, once you cross, for instance, the tier 1 or the tier 2s, you then start to go dark as well, because the ability to actually digitalize down to that layer with the right complexity and cost-effective tool sets becomes a very, very big drag, right? Again, larger organizations can always invest in their home countries, either in Europe or the States, and dedicate that money into it. But you cannot necessarily do that for your 100, 200, 500,000 different suppliers in your entire network. And that becomes a very, very cost-inhibitive kind of a situation. And this is where, again, it goes down to also the tool sets that would be leveraged, right? We have to look at it from much more of a democratization of tools that allows for the adoption of it without a cost being a big hindrance. And from Arcstone's standpoint, the way that we look at it is tool sets that are running on the ground to be able to capture information and capture data should ideally be free. And the Arcstone methodology for this is using Arcstone's ArcLight toolset, which we actually roll out to all of our suppliers at no cost. And that's basically the best way to get this common platform of information to start flowing. A lot of these suppliers have enough problems of their own, especially with COVID coming through. Just getting enough business is already going to be hard enough. So trying to then move and sell additional solutions on top of when they're struggling is just usually not something that they're going to be comfortable with. And finding the manpower to even support these tools is another kind of headache. So where we stand, and I think where a lot of solution providers kind of stand as well, is that how do we help support this ecosystem moving forward? Because a fully digitized ecosystem benefits everyone. It's the same concept of the rising tide lifts all boats. And what we need to be able to do is find ways and mechanisms to support these SMEs and these smaller suppliers that is very critical to the supply chain, but it's just not very feasible given the existing marketplace of solutions. And Arcstone has a place to play in this, Quincus has a place to play in this, and everyone else has a role to play in this as well. But I think driving that and being kind of the leaders, I think this is where Arcstone and Quincus has been very strong in pushing our tool sets in a way that allows for easy adoption, cost-effective adoption, and getting the entire supply chain digitalized is the first and most fundamental one. Because then afterwards, anything with optimization or machine learning or AI is the fun part. You have the data to start to play with. But until you get to that stage, I think that's still a lot of groundwork that needs to be done, especially within Southeast Asia, where you see a lot of the base of manufacturing is the small, medium enterprises. And some of the large local entities that are still struggling to figure out, yes, like I know how to get started roughly in terms of what I need to do for digitalization, but I don't really know how to implement. Like, what is the long-term plan? how do I go about, which tools to purchase or which tools to deploy? That's still a bit of a journey. I think everyone's gotten enough years of kind of the drilling of Industry 4.0 importance down their throats, but not necessarily having the right steps for the next couple of years to be able to action on. And this is where I think, again, a collaborative effect is necessary. It can't be done by Arcstone alone, can't be done by Quincus alone. We need to continue to pull together a consortium or a team or an ecosystem of players, constructing of both the consultants, the solutions providers, the service providers, the hardware providers, and that will definitely be the one that will be able to move the market the quickest.
Right, right. So it's basically integrating different maturity of systems for all these SMEs in Southeast Asia has been a challenge. And the solution is going to be integrate all the system cost effectively the next few years with COVID still being around, right? Okay, so one of the questions from the poll is, what features are you guys looking for in this supply chain technology? If it's different from the system integration that we just discussed about, maybe Jonathan and Willson.
Right. I think, so I'll kickstart this off. The way that I look at this is similar to Willson, is my guess is it is very much about being able to allow these ecosystem players to latch on. Having that visibility is one, and we need to digitize to begin with. And to the point of Willson, not just in Southeast Asia, but globally, we see a lot of providers and smaller operators and logistics operators running on pen and paper or Excel sheets at best. And that's something that we need to change. Now, how do we change that? We provide a integrated solution, and the way we do that is by our open application systems and our open APIs is allowing for anything to integrate and build out. So that would be my number one to build out. And after that, it becomes about control, and then the analytics obviously becomes critical when we start actually looking at some kind of optimization. Return management is going to be very specific for components such as e-commerce. Right, and I think we're certainly going to see more and more solutions come up there as e-commerce continues its stride, and the rocket ship it's been on for the past year, really, since COVID. So I think that will certainly become a critical component. And we see our customers, and I'm sure Willson is seeing that too, really ask about this as well. But my number one would be integration. Number two, control, probably.
I think the integration portion is a huge factor of this, right? Again, if we're talking about the importance of an ecosystem only works well when each person or each entity has an open ability to communicate both back and forth. And without an open API or an access to a configurable API, that becomes a very destructive process of trying to perform. And having that is, I think, the most fundamental in terms of any solution sets I think that you look into. Non-closed systems, abilities to have a transparent but secure integration capabilities on the platform level and on the systems level is of utmost importance. I would definitely highlight that portion. Now, when you look at it from a supply chain perspective, at least if we were to take it back into the manufacturing context, Arcstone has always looked at a transformation process in kind of three different phases. Okay. The first phase is really going to be on visibility. Yeah. And visibility means that we just need to see everything that's happening on the ground, right? Yeah. And I think when you look into logistics and into the supply chain aspect, it's the exact same philosophy. So gaining this visibility means that, again, it goes back to integration. We need access to be able to tap into the sensors, the controllers, the machines, the equipment, the people, the apps, the tools that people are using, the software solutions they're using as well, and pull that in, right? And that provides that first layer foundation of the visibility. Second step is really on the control mechanisms. So when we talk about control, this is where we start leveraging the mechanisms to actually push executions and orders and commands out into the field. So when I need to schedule something, when something should be delivered, when should I go for pickup, when should I execute for a return policy, when that information should come back and inform, for instance, manufacturing exchange because we got 30% return rates on something. All of these types of things is part of that control mechanism that can only be possible when we have the visibility. So that aspect right there is where a lot of the analytical portions can slowly start trickling in. And then the final portion is the optimization. So 3 steps: visibility, control, and then optimization. And optimization is where you have all the fun stuff, right? This is where the analytics can come in. This is where the predictive maintenance come in. This is where the capabilities of modeling and forecasting for demand can come in for the supply chain side. That's a lot of the heavy duty kind of analytics and machine learning AI portions can leverage those capabilities. But if you jump the gun or you do this in the wrong order of that 1, 2, 3 that we mentioned, you're highly bound to do something that's just garbage in and garbage out. So this particular step-by-step procedure, and looking back at the kind of the poll that you had just mentioned, integration has to be key. That is absolutely number one, and then move on from there.
Yeah, I think just to kind of round it off, we have an equivalent on that when we look at the moving components, right? So Willson laid out very detailed what happened on the factory floors. Yeah. I think it's a similar process, but I would start with digitization, then building accountability, right? So building accountability in supply chains and comes with that visibility is incredibly important. We need to know who has touched a particular shipment or which provider has been there at what time, where has it been delivered, and how has it been delivered, who has signed off on it, who has paid for it. Those type of questions and components need to be answered, and that's very much in a visibility and accountability component. And then lastly is the optimization, right? So you see that a similar pattern in when we look inside of a factory floor. We also have, when we look at moving components, where we see optimization can only come once we have that data from the digitization, can only come once we know that supply chain is secure, in terms of we know that what actually happens on the ground is the information that we have. And then you can start optimizing in real time and building out those components. So we follow a very similar pattern in that sense.
I would like to transition this a little bit also into the importance of how manufacturing is now also adapting very heavily to the changing kind of consumer behaviors that we see. And a lot of this, of course, as you can imagine, is driven heavily by e-commerce, which is essentially kind of where Quincus has been very powerful in being able to support. But that also has a massive rippling effect on how manufacturers can address these types of situations. In terms of, for example, traditional FMCG production processes. If you imagine, it used to be that I could produce, 100,000 bottles of shampoo, put it in a warehouse, and distribute accordingly as and when needed. And based on unit economics, it just makes sense. It's more cost effective. But what we have seen here with, the thing about FMCG work now is that it only takes one Instagram post to determine if that product will either sell out tomorrow or never sell again, simply because some sort of consumer perception would have shifted, right? So this means that in the long term, holding inventory is actually a very massive risk for FMCG companies. And for FMCG, where you're starting to look into is the more and more focus on something known as, in the ARTC, where we're working at the Advanced Remanufacturing Technology Center, the concept of hyper-personalization or the hyper-personalization line is something that is heavily invested into right now to figure out how are there mechanisms where traditionally based on unit economics, we would produce in batches to now move it to a lot size of 1. Is there a capability to do so? And if you look at FMCGs, a lot of the production processes are very similar from brand to brand. Components are very similar as well. So if there was a way to marry the two connections between the supply chain, the e-commerce sites, and also to the manufacturing process itself, then we have much stronger capabilities of doing a streamlined lot size of 1 process, from ordering to delivery to the manufacturing process. And that's kind of where the ultimate goal and line is, right? If you can imagine, whatever you decide to order tomorrow is actually being produced on the same day, and it's sent over to the delivery folks and the 3PLs, which will then pick it up on the same day and ship it by the evening. That is the ultimate goal. No inventory, materials are kept and stocked at where they are. Demand is forecasted as best as possible. That's the end-to-end vision. Right? And that requires a huge amount of new solutions to be integrated and developed, not only from the hardware component, but also from the digital layer as well, to make this whole system flow. But that's the holy grail, right? A lot size of 1 for FMCG, right? And there used to be this old story, I believe, it was actually run by, if I can recall, it would have been Kimberly Clark. It was an interesting little story, which was the idea that a second someone in the grocery store pulls down 1 box of toilet paper, a tree gets cut down somewhere in the forest. And that's the level of kind of detail that we want to get into. And this is what Industry 4.0 Arcstone and Quincus is able to kind of push towards, again, with that integration and that level of integration. So those are the areas that we find kind of the fun and the interesting kind of optimization routes that we can perform.
So yeah, having visibility and control and also optimizing it will be the areas that we would like to grow as in this FMCG area, right? Okay. Just wondering if we have any questions from the attendees. Just checking here. Okay, so no questions yet. So feel free to type your questions on the chat room. Meanwhile, I continue with a few more questions to Jonathan and Willson here. So Jonathan, what do you think this coronavirus pandemic has reshaped the FMCG consumption trend, and how is this region, Asia market, evolving around this topic?
So I'll speak specifically around how supply chains have evolved, and I think Willson is probably a better person to speak about the FMCG component.
Sure.
But when we look at the supply chains and how they've shifted, we see a lot of providers suddenly having become aware that they need to change. And they need to change in a number of facets. They need to firstly change in a component of actually making data digital and being able to provide actual real-time information. A lot of providers pre-COVID could still not do that, right? We're still struggling with that and are still at this point. I think the second component is providers have also become a lot more aware with disruptions. We always had disruptions before, but now we are dealing with large disruptions that are entirely unanticipated, depending on lockdowns, depending on how stores are opening and closing, depending on how borders are opening and closing, and that builds in a lot. As providers as well as a technology company, we need to allow providers to build in that flexibility in that supply chain, as well as that real-time visibility. So I think that's really how we're seeing a lot of changes happening on the supply chain side, where providers themselves are becoming aware that that needs to happen. And that's going to stay, that's here to stay, right? We're seeing a lot of traction based on that. And we're here to help those supply chain providers to be able to go through that journey, albeit very tough journey, right? And I think that's really the focus of ours, and that's been the focus of Quincus as well, to be able to help them digitize and build that accountability. That would be the major trend. The secondary major trend is obviously the shift towards e-commerce. This is obviously an important topic, and I won't talk too much about it because we'll be here till tomorrow. But that is also probably a trend that will stay here to stay. And it also means that we're dealing with a lot more express shipments. We're dealing with a lot faster supply chains, in which providers, again, needs to change their dynamics and their operations to be able to do that, which also has a huge margin impact, right? And that is reshifting the way that supply chain providers are thinking about it, and operators themselves. That would be my 2 cents on that.
I think the virus situation essentially has shifted certain things. And I think you've heard a lot of this kind of, to borrow a term that I think the McKinsey folks have been using quite a bit now, the K-shaped recovery concept, right? But the K-shaped recovery or K-shaped process has actually been kind of hit throughout the FMCG world as well. You can see things such as, household cleaning supplies and things that you do use for maintaining your living space fly off the shelves, right? But things such as cosmetics and things that are nice to use when you go out have plummeted, right? And so it doesn't mean that necessarily net you're still slowly riding positive in that avenue, but it also shifts a lot of your demands in terms of the certain SKUs are no longer being touched, but others are flying off the shelves. So adjusting for that process is a very big condition now in terms of how do we quickly adopt, adjust, and align production processes to catch up. Because there were a lot of facilities that, especially for the FMCGs, is that their production sites, wherever they were, had trouble getting the raw materials for them to actually produce. So it wasn't necessarily about their factory was, under a kind of COVID quarantine or whatnot. Even if everyone was able to go to work, they had nothing to work on. And so this particular process of resiliency in the supply chain is becoming much, much more important, because where we see the risk is that regardless of how cost effective a particular country or site or location is, putting all of your eggs into one basket becomes just this uncertainty of who knows what may happen. It could be a quarantine for the country that just shuts the borders for a while. It could be that something happens within the region that could be of an issue, could be anything politically related as well. That can cause issues, and having that ability to have second, third, fourth sources of material becomes critical, as it is a market that will disappear. Right? There's only so much toilet paper and so much cleaning supplies that you need. But once that is purchased, you lose that customer. So competition, as you imagine in FMCG, is a razor thin margin as it is already. So definitely is going to be adjustments to the methodologies how production is going to be done. Definitely because increases in the reliability of the supply chain is important as well. But this also adds to the complexity. So in a way, this is actually definitely a big boost to the importance of digitalization, because you've basically doubled, tripled, quadrupled your complexity of the number of suppliers and processes you have, and you need tools to manage that as well.
Right. And in addition to tools, do you think artificial intelligence could also help in this area? Or how would artificial intelligence will benefit the FMCG? This question actually came from the audience.
Sure, I think it's a wonderful question. Machine learning AI tool sets have always been a large factor in the FMCG production process. And if you look at it, a lot of it stems from the availability of data. So where we see a lot of good progress is that if you look, for instance, into specific inspection tools on vision systems to measure for defects and issues, there's been a lot of good progress there. Not the best, but definitely a lot of good progress. Why? Is because they've been able to snap pictures. They have the information available. Right? For instance, machines that are running in a continuous basis have data flowing and has the availability. Doing predictive maintenance using AI to determine when it's the best time to shut the machine down for repairs, that's also possible. So there is zero doubt, I think, in a lot of people's minds of the power and capabilities of machine learning AI. But the importance is, do you have the underlying foundation to support it? Right? An AI and a machine learning algorithm essentially is a child. If you feed the child bad things, it will grow up to be a bad child. Right? And if you feel that good things, it will become a very smart child. And it's the same exact methodology. So how you feed it and what information you feed it is going to be critical. And that comes from either automated data or manually input data from the shop floor.
Right. The visibility goes back to what we just discussed earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
And just to finalize and add on to that, I think that the visibility and the being able to provide more data is critical. But the way that machine learning will also significantly help and is significantly helping is also in the element of being able to demand plan and be able to be reactive on your supply chain and be more reactive, right? Before, you could only demand plan what you would do 6 months from now and build out your production flow and your supply chain accordingly. Now, as we are able to start predicting more because of the machine learning components, we're able to actually track disruptions better and be able to in real time react against those. That's where machine learning, fed by the data that comes from these sensors and comes from as well as the demand side, we're able to actually react a lot better, and that is critical. So that's where ML and AI would certainly very much help.
Right. So in predicting the supply and demand forecast, and so in related to that, there's another question from the audience. It's, I think during COVID time, people will just order and it will be delivered to their home. So it's direct to customer model that we're seeing. So the question is, how viable is this intermediation of FMCG to eliminate retail from the supply chain as a way to reduce prices of products to the end customer? So Willson, maybe you want to.
Sure, happy to. And I think this is, again, also one of those big wishes by most FMCG companies, I'm sure, right? Because if you can cut out the middleman, there's a lot more kind of things to be able to do with that. Now, the tricky part of this is that it's a wish. And I think a lot of this goes back to kind of individuals thinking about what would they do in their normal lives, right? So prior to this, even for large players, if we were just to take a look at Amazon, they invested into Whole Foods and bought them out. They started doing their own brick and mortar facilities, which goes counterintuitive to what their process actually is. But if you think about it, using that as a doubling up of a distribution center, that might make a lot of sense. So instead, I think it's not a matter of a black and white, will it get rid of it? But I would expect more of a consolidation process to occur, right? Which is where if you were to look at, for instance, grocery stores, retail shops, etc. They're being squeezed on both ends, right? And so the only way to really either survive is to either merge or be acquired, and to allow for the optimization to proceed. In the ideal world, of course, it would just be, everything's direct, right? So you order something, it's produced in one shot, because again, we go into hyper personalization and you just get shipped back. Right? Now, but there will always be certain scenarios where people will say, you know what, I got to see it before I believe it, or I got to be able to touch it and feel it to see if that's really what I want to wear. Or, if I don't see the vegetables, I'm not buying it, because who knows where these vegetables are coming from. So you can have as much traceability as I want, but you're not going to be able to change people's mind on that. So there will always be, I think, a premium to be paid for those particular items. So I don't think it will disappear. But definitely I think what has happened with COVID is that it has enabled a lot of people that traditionally would not have bought anything online and would have preferred to go down to the shop. They could no longer do that. So it has opened up a category to allow them to do so. So I think there will be further consolidation. There will be further shrinking. And I think it will be a difficult time for the retail markets to continue as we go along, but they would have to be quite innovative to kind of sustain.
That's right. And we're seeing some really interesting delivery models pop up, right? We're seeing micro hubs pop up in big urban cities where it is effectively the store doubling up also as a distribution center. And then suddenly we're not doing deliveries from some distribution center that's far flung right out of the city, but is right in the middle of the heart of the city. And suddenly we're doing last mile deliveries out of that. I think a combination of looking at how we're reconfiguring the organization of the supply chain will certainly help this optimization, as well as look at reducing the costs. And I think that's what we need to be prepared for. Those new types of models and new delivery models that we're seeing throughout the supply chain.
Okay. And then, with all this visibility of data that we're trying to integrate with the system in the next few years, and maybe blockchain will be an area that is going to be popular. So one of the questions is, how will the impact of blockchain on this FMCG area?
I think it's very important for people when they think about blockchain is that blockchain is a tool. A tool used in the wrong way can give you as much pain and suffering as you can imagine, right? And I think one of the things about the blockchain components, even for Arcstone itself, we use that quite heavily, but it has to be used for the right purpose and for the right reason. Blockchains provide transparency and security and fidelity of the data that has been transmitted from place to place. And that is a good use case, especially from a supply chain coordination side, where you're managing the supply processes and the manufacturing processes of your suppliers. And this is where essentially ArcNet's tool sets from Arcstone will take care of that portion for you, right? Now, however, if you're trying to apply blockchain for the hell of applying blockchain, you will end up putting yourselves into a corner that may not be reasonable. So there are also very key cases of what type of blockchain components are you using, why are you using it, and what is the purpose? And making sure that you have alignment on that is very critical. Otherwise, again, it's not a tool for everything. It is not a silver bullet. There is no such things as silver bullets. Finding the right use case is the most critical.
Okay. So in this area then, to help FMCG inventory management and waste management during this lockdown, as we touched on blockchain earlier, so perhaps back to AI, do you think AI can help in that area, inventory management and waste management? I think Jonathan touched on that a little bit earlier. What do you think, Jonathan?
No, absolutely, right. It comes back down to this demand planning. If we know more accurately what's happening and when consumers are purchasing and how they're purchasing it, whether it's online for a last mile delivery or whether they're actually going into store, that allows us to actually build a better inventory plan for the particular stores in the region that we're covering. And machine learning can absolutely help with that. I prefer calling it machine learning versus AI for the given reason that it is just a consumption of data and then being able to interpret that data in a smart and effective way to be able to do that. There are solutions out there, including some of ours, that are starting to look at that and say, okay, well, we can more effectively rejig the supply chain more, as well as inventory to make sure that we're in real time delivering. I'd like to say that just in time is sometimes very overrated, but this is where machine learning does come in place, right? This is where it actually allows for us to be able to deliver things in time and just in time.
Okay. Okay, there are more questions coming in as we're towards the end of this webinar, but this is good. So, okay, the last one, or I mean, the last few ones, maybe I can combine these questions. So they're saying like companies such as Shopee are able to deliver products with very cheap shipping fee. So the question is, how is that possible operationally, and whether it's sustainable after COVID? And maybe similar to this is micro fulfillment in last mile, whether this is going to be a game changer.
Right.
Okay, maybe we
So,
start with those two. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's a great question. And look, this is going to be a question that we're going to be answering for a while. So I'm we can talk a little bit about the different regions because it very greatly depends in which region we're talking about. So for instance, in China, you can send anything for about $1. And it's going very quickly to about half a dollar now at this point. And the reason why you can do that in China is because you have this mass volume, right? And this mass volume allows you to have, for instance, one guy going up and down one building and delivering in that one building. And that's how you get to really cheaply deliver prices. Now, if we extrapolate that to outside of that, it's a similar concept that is true, that as we increase the volumes, we're going to start seeing a lot of consolidation and working through that. However, and there's always a but in this, there is an element of, there is a limit in which this is viable, right? And especially when we're dealing with a complex region such as Southeast Asia, where it's not one market, right? We're dealing with 7 different markets. It's incredibly hard to keep these prices competitive, and a lot of this is going to be very much given by also, you know, how e-commerce is, and the the underlying logistics companies evolve, how their relationships evolve, right? We're seeing a lot of investments by e-commerces into logistics companies to essentially be able to drive that cost consolidation. And we'll continue seeing that. We last week saw the consolidation of SF Express and Carry for exactly the similar reasons, where we're saying, okay, well, these cost consolidation will happen. So it is possible to do that, and is it sustainable? Probably, as e-commerce keeps kicking up. But some of the core concepts that we talked about today, such as digitization, having all of that data, being able to optimize continuously, is going to have to continue to be true if we want to keep sustaining that and keep financing that. And I think that's really, you know, the question that we'll be answering for the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay. All right. How about the micro fulfillment in last mile?
Yeah, I do think it's a game changer. You know, we're seeing this more and more come up in North America, not so much yet in Southeast Asia, but in North America, there are a couple of companies that are interesting companies that are starting to do this, and you know, successfully so, right? Brands are jumping on them because suddenly they can cost effectively do the last mile, and last mile is a hugely expensive component, very much because of also return deliveries that are happening. But suddenly you're not doing return deliveries over 15, 20 kilometers, you're doing return deliveries over a kilometer circle. So those economics you can really start driving. And I think a lot of this will be a game changer in many ways. Similarly to doing 2-hour deliveries, 1-hour delivery, things like that. Will as consumers will continue being demanding. You know, we won't give that up. Not once we've had a taste now that we can have something in 2 hours from now with Amazon. Everyone, you know, they've set a new benchmark, and everyone's going to start striving for that.
Okay, understand. Thank you, Jonathan. So, okay, one last question here. I think we have time for one last question. Maybe this is Wilson. So, what do you think about investing heavily in automation, especially in manufacturing side, if it's about storage and retrieval of goods or retrieval of your raw materials, right? Yeah, what do you think? Whether it's a good investment? Yeah.
I think this question is coming more so with regards to the concept of ASRS, right? Automated storage and retrieval systems. And this is actually a very common thing that we're seeing more and more of, especially in a landlocked and kind of spaces where you find within Singapore, where it's, you know, it's extremely expensive to have enough real estate to be able to have kind of wide stretching kind of warehouses. And having an ability to do ASRS or automated processes to invest into, to pick and store without the need for people to be involved, saves a lot of actual real estate. And so you do see that as a potential gain. And additionally, when most people go into the ASRS portions, it's really about the inflexibility of the tool set itself that you're designing. If you're designing it to be a very rigid thing that only can store and retrieve a very small subset of parts or components, unless your operations don't plan to change in the next 20, 30 years, you really have to have that mapped out. So yes, is it good to invest? I do believe so, because if you have the high volumes, if you are in a place where essentially it is a high real estate cost, it is a high labor cost, it makes a lot of sense to look into a fully automated process. But if you do not plan this out properly, you have missed, for example, a potential shift in the packaging sizes, in the item sizes that you plan to store and retrieve, then you may end up having a very big white elephant inside a facility where only about maybe, right now you may have designed it so that 95% of your things can be stored. But if you didn't plan out long enough, say 15 years later, you realize that only 10% of what you actually originally intended can be stored, then you're in deep trouble, right? So it's really about planning and flexibility. Finding an ASRS system that allows you to shift and dynamically alter as you have changes coming through would be a good enough or a very good consideration to invest more into than it is to invest into a cheaper system that locks you into only a particular type of storage capabilities. So that would be my best advice. It comes down to a CapEx model, and it comes down into a demand forecasting for the next X number of years model. So it will require finance teams to go down and crunch the numbers.
Mm-hmm. And flexibility will be also helpful, right? With
absolutely, absolutely.
Environment, right? Okay. Well, we're almost at the 45-minute mark. So let's see if there's any other last question here. Okay, so it seems like we've covered all the questions. And then thank you so much for joining our webinar. Our next item will be call to action. You will be receiving a text on the details for the call to action, but I'll just mention it here also. Wilson's company, it's called Arcstone, so they can be reached at contact@arcstone.co. And for Quincus, you can reach out to us via the commercial team at sales@quincus.com. So yes, if these details can be shared with attendees, that would be great. And we really appreciate your time in joining this webinar. And we hope that this session has been helpful and informative for all of you. And we look forward also to hearing your feedback and also topics that you're interested in to hear in the next webinar.
Thank you so much for having us, Lina.
Thank you so much, Lina. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.